So basically, you are responsible for all these devices we have in our pockets.
Some of that stuff, yeah.
So you were...
The heart and the skin.
But basically, you created the first microprocessor.
Yes, and the second, and the third, and the fourth. After that, many others came along.
So it's easy to say you have always been at the avant-garde of the thinking of this little planet.
Well, it was more technology than thinking.
But basically what I'm leading to is that Federico now, with his foundation, the Federico and Elvia Faggin Foundation, is now, what are you trying to do now again? You say it with your own word, because it's so cool that I'm afraid I'm going to mess it up by saying it. You are?
Well, I'm trying to understand, obviously, the nature of consciousness, as we are all trying to do here, but trying to do it in a special way. In other words, trying to do by understanding a physics that starts with cognitive principles, as opposed to having two silos, the science on one end and spirituality on the other, one catering to the inner world, the other catering to the outer world, recognizing the unity that both inner and outer worlds have, and recognizing that from the science perspective as well as from the inner spiritual perspective, and develop a theory, mathematical theory, not of consciousness itself, because I don't believe that has to be the starting point, but developing a theory of the conversations that conscious beings have with each other, which manifest as matter. So matter really is the shape, the ink with which symbols are written for the conversations of conscious beings.
Now you understand why I didn't try to say it. So basically you're doing the essence of what we are trying to do. You appear in our life a few years ago in this stage, and we were all like, really? Amazed by honestly, the guts you have to take a task like this, because nobody in the scientific world had the courage to even consider it. Nobody in their right mind, or I mean, I don't want to sound, but anyway, no, but whatever. Forget about what I just said. No, seriously, it takes a lot of courage.
Yeah, it does.
You are redefining our understanding of science and spirituality. You're redefining science here.
Well, but first I have to succeed in that. So right now it's just it's a statement of intention. Though I have a model, but the model is just the beginning of a journey of discovery.
But if history proves of something, you had a model in your mind of a little square thing that could make a lot of calculation that can put us all of a sudden, a few years later, in the ability to have these little toys.
That is true. And I also had the model of the technology that made it possible, which is the silicon gate technology, the MOS devices that made possible the microprocessor, the dynamic memories, the the non-volatile memories, all the stuff that we have in our pockets these days. And also the touch pads and the touch screens that we use every day in our phones. We developed those in my last company, Synaptics. That's when I started working on neural networks. I wanted to make a chip that actually learns instead of being programmed.
Okay.
That's when I encounter consciousness.
So that's the
for the
switch.
first time.
That's an interesting, to me, fascinating. Yeah. How you go from the microchip world to consciousness. That's a big jump. And I want to understand what has been your portal, what has been the thing that...
Well, very simple, actually. I was a materialist. I'm a physicist, so any kind of religious upbringing which I had, grew up in Italy as Catholic, so you know how that works, right? So little by little, I moved away from the dogmatic church and all the teachings, and figure out that pretty much it must be, everything must be matter, really, which is what physics has been telling us. And so if everything is matter, then a computer should be conscious too. I mean, that's what they tell us. They tell us that all you need to do is to create a proper structure, and eventually, lo and behold, the computer becomes conscious. So believing that, I started working on my own, because that was not a project in my own company that was appropriate. But I started working on my own, trying to figure out how can I make a conscious computer. And the more I thought about, the more impossible the task began and appear. And so at one point, but I was intense, as I am always been intense in whatever I do. And so
as your wife can say, probably.
So at one point, I had a extraordinary experience of consciousness, not induced by any drugs. It was spontaneous. It was something that blew my mind away. Basically, I was the world, and the world was me. And I was both the world and the observer of the world. And the world was love. And love was permeating everything, and love was what actually built the world and built me. So I'm made of the same stuff that the world is made of. That blew me away. That made the problem of making a conscious computer so much harder.
When was that? How long ago?
That was about 30 years ago.
And since then,
And since then, then of course, when that happened, it was like, that experience lasted perhaps 20 seconds to a minute. That's all. And it changed myself from this way to that way. Just that simple experience. The feelings that were inherent in that experience were so powerful and so unbelievable. So, you have to experience them. You cannot describe them. So those feelings, that sense of being the world. I was the world. And so when you have that, you know that that's the way it is. You don't have to prove a mathematical theorem. You know, okay? So when that happened, everything changed for me. So that's why I'm saying, I will say later, the computers, as we know them, classical computers cannot be conscious.
Wow.
And I will explain why.
So this, to me, the beauty of it, that being a scientist and a materialist, having that experience brought you there. It's so beautiful. To me, my personal experience happened when I was 16. I got this boom.
Yeah.
But I never understood anything about the science, if you wish.
Yeah.
I never had the, but it's beautiful that whatever it is, because in the position you were, with the work you were doing, adding that layer, give us hope to come up with. I so always admired you, Federico, and I'm not ashamed to say it here in front of everybody. To me, you are such a model of extreme intelligence and heart, and the work you're doing and what you're trying to bring to the world, to me, is like, wow, me and us as an organization, we are so behind you in whatever you're doing.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Federico. So, and now I'm going to bring Edoardo Frankello. So we are all Italian. Ed Frenkel. You know Ed. I'm not going to introduce him. He has a mic.
Hello.
And you really should be Italian because you're late. Perfect.
I'm wearing an Italian shirt. So
Oh, that's a start.
I figured that with an Italian, I have to dress up. So.
Thank you, brother.
We're going to mess up our microphones.
No.
Anyway.
All right, so.
Good morning. How are you guys doing?
Great.
Great? Excellent. So,
It looks like I already gave my introduction, so it's your turn.
right, so I always wanted to be on stage with Federico. So this is a dream come true.
And likewise, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Because actually, perhaps not coincidentally, he and I met exactly around the time when I felt kind of a deep transformation happening inside me. It was just before that SAND conference 3 years ago. Our friend Julia Mosbridge introduced us, and we had a dinner in Berkeley. Yes. And it was such a wow for me. You know, there's this guy who invented the first microprocessor, which we'll talk about more perhaps later. And I'm having dinner with him, and we shared very deep personal stories. And the older I get, the more I appreciate the value, I would say it's invaluable, of this kind of personal interaction when we share things which we hold very deeply. It is really a communication at the level of the heart, one could say, where the words is just a kind of a sideshow. And that gives you confidence, perhaps also confirmation, which was necessary for me at that time, and kind of a sense of it's going to be fine, you know. It's actually everything's great, you know. Kind of like I remember coming out of that restaurant, you know, and it's like there were stars. Maybe there were no stars, but I saw the stars in the sky. So
I didn't punch you though.
that be within the tradition of Zen. Sometimes they hit people with a stick. So anyway, and especially in our community, shall we say, the scientific community, it's rare to meet someone who is, first of all, has had the kind of deep realization of their own being, and also is not afraid to share that with others. And I think that it's something which is really becoming more and more of a necessity in our community to talk about. And I guess it's not by chance that we are meeting at the heart of Silicon Valley, which is, yes, I do believe it has a heart. It may not be connected to its heart fully at the moment, but it will. And Silicon Valley, which determines our daily activity to such a great extent these days. And so the first thing I want to ask you is, do you ever go, you know, since you were the father, if I may say so, of the first microprocessor, which is at the basis of all modern technology, be it computers or smartphones and all kinds of devices. Do you ever go, what have I done?
Well, actually, when I see kids having dinner and each self-absorbed with his own intelligent phone, not even talking to each other, looking at that phone, I actually ask myself, what's going on here? I don't think that's a good use of technology, frankly, but there it is.
I was actually reading a little bit about this because I knew this basic story, but I found this website which is called Intel4004.com.
Yeah.
Which is the name of the first Intel processor.
Yeah.
In fact, there was an earlier one at the Fairchild Semiconductor where you worked, right?
Never a single chip. The microprocessor is a single chip device.
I see, the technology was developed earlier.
The technology that made it possible, I developed at Fairchild.
You developed at Fairchild, yes. And then you created actually the chip at
also
Intel.
The chip. Yeah, the Intel.
And that was, there were several, but the main one was 4004.
Yeah, then 8008 was the first 8-bit, and then the 8080.
Right.
Then I started my own company called Zilog and developed the Z80, which is still in volume production today, which is unbelievable, about 40 years later.
Right. Plus, he also invented a touchpad, touch
screens.
Touch screen. So every aspect of the technology that we use these days has your imprint, has your signature. In fact,
of it, yeah.
he literally signed the first processor I found from that website with his initials. How did that happen?
Well, when I was done, it looked like a painting, right? I mean, except with only one difference. Every detail had a purpose that was functional as opposed to aesthetic.
Right. But there was some element of aesthetics.
But it was beautiful.
How big was it?
Well, I mean, it was drawn at 500x, so it was a huge, actually, it was drawn in several sheets of mylar.
We wouldn't be able to put it in our pockets.
No, but because it had to be then reduced to full scale. Full scale was about 3 millimeters by 4 millimeters. Okay. But the drawing was done at high, at much larger scale, and so it looked beautiful. So I signed it.
like Van Gogh signing, Starry Night. It's beautiful because this is the art. This is the art of, and that was still 20th century, but it's symbolic, I think, of the general transition in some sense that has happened. That it's not really a transition, but in a sense, I feel, especially when I teach at Berkeley, so I do interact with my students and so on. I feel as though art is less on their mind, so to speak, but technology is more so. Yeah. So in a sense, but the beauty is that we can find aesthetic elements in the works of modern technology or science and so on, so that still brings out that energy from the heart of appreciation, of this awe. This awe is beautiful. Yeah. So it doesn't come from the mind alone, right? So that's a very nice.
But actually, that project was really, for me, it was really a work of love. It really was. I didn't know it, because I didn't know what love is really until I had that experience that I mentioned earlier. So then I recognized that it really was a work of love.
When we make
because I put so much of myself into it. I work 80 hours a week, maybe even more sometimes, and for about 11 months, and that was, I put everything that I had into it. So, and it was not just intellect. It was, and I would wake up in the morning with problems that I had that were solved in my sleep. So then I would go to work, and I had already figured out, how to do the next step, and on it goes. So
that sounds familiar. I think I remember, those moments when I wanted to go to sleep sooner so that I wake up and I can continue working on this mathematics problem. And then and of course, it's not just the love is present. It's just, it may not be seen as what it is, clearly at that moment. Yeah. But I think that to really be able to make a discovery and to really be able to affect your fellow human beings, it has to be driven by love. It has to have the element.
Yes.
Otherwise, if it's just a chore, yes, you can do something, but it's not going to be something of lasting importance. It's not going to be something profound. And so in that sense, for us, cerebral guys, let's say, left brainiacs, sometimes I say, this becomes a portal to discovering the self. Yeah. Because for various reasons, we may be closed to other dimensions, right? And we can talk about that as well. But still, it's like no matter how many defenses you put around yourself, love will find a way to penetrate through them, to kind of trickle through. And then one day, that drop will melt the ice. So what I found interesting, though, is because we titled our conversation artificial. Well, it was kind of a joke, so because everybody talks about artificial intelligence and so on, and so we titled it Intelligence, Natural and Artificial, right? And so I think we're both passionate about this issue, and so But I feel like it's kind of cannot really be separated from our personal journeys, so to speak, right? So it's interesting to see also how our deliberations on that reflect on, on ourselves, right?
Yeah.
But what I found very interesting here, to kind of start the conversation on that and talk a little bit about that, is I watched a video of the interview that was was published recently on the Sand YouTube channel, an interview with you. And you mentioned this earlier as well, that for you, one of the real questions was, can I build a machine which can be conscious? Can I build a computer which is conscious? Which is a natural question for a researcher and an engineer.
If you believe that everything is matter, you should be able to do it.
Right, right.
So try it.
And so how was it? How did it? What I'm curious about is whether was that something that actually kind of pushed you to discover more about yourself? Would that be a fair?
I think so. I think that was certainly, it was not the only element. There were other deeper elements that became, clear later. But overtly, that was the key thing. Was what is consciousness? How can I, what is it? What's going on here?
But so
but I realized immediately, or very shortly after I was asking that question and trying to figure out what to do, the fundamental difference is that we perceive through feelings, through qualia, right? And I didn't know the word qualia, but I knew what a feeling is and what a sensation is. And so I understood immediately the difference between a sensation and a feeling in electrical signals, whether they are in the brain or in a computer, or in a computer, right? So electrical signals are electrical signals. How can they produce sensations and feelings? What's going on here? Where are those sensations and feelings coming from? Where is comprehension coming from? Which is another dimension of consciousness, which I was not so aware in those days, but became much more clear to me later as I studied consciousness. In fact, what happened was for me that after a couple of years that I couldn't figure out how could possibly make a conscious computer, I had that experience, and that threw me into...
So can you tell us a little more, because it was before the video started, I suppose. So maybe.
Well, that experience, just the one that I mentioned earlier, but that threw me into a journey of self-discovery. In other words, I told myself, okay, well, so I don't understand what consciousness is. So let me study consciousness the only way that we can study consciousness, which is as a first-person experience.
Right.
I cannot study consciousness by opening your brain and measuring signals in your brain. I mean, that's...
I suppose you could, but you might destroy me in the process.
No, I don't want to do that to you, of course. But all you do, you see correlates of conscious. You don't see the conscious experience. Consciousness and conscious experience are first-person experiences only. And so so I started a journey of discovery, self-discovery, by reading, taking courses. I mean, I did all kinds of things. One of the things that was the most useful for me was I did 10 years of the Diamond Heart. The Diamond Heart is the school of the teaching of Hamid Ali, which is also Almas, right? A.H. Almas is the pen name,
right?
And he is generally here every year. I haven't seen him here this year, but generally he's here every year. So he's also part of the family, the Sand family. But so I learned a tremendous amount, because that system is a system that integrates psychology and spirituality into an integrated whole. And so, and through that process and through my own other personal discoveries, I had a very large number of extraordinary experiences of consciousness that reveal all kinds of possible states. I never took drugs, so this is not drug-induced. It was all spontaneous, from out of body to what people call cosmic consciousness. My consciousness was everywhere. I mean, I felt I was inside the blades of grass and the trees and everything else. Very, in other words, my consciousness was in the real world, not as in a vision of love, but in the real world. Mm-hmm. And it was there. I was there. You know, that kind of experience.
There was no barrier between.
No barrier. No barrier. And so on and so forth. So all of those were all spontaneous. And they taught me dimensions of consciousness, dimensions of experience that, you know, are non-ordinary, you know, and they cannot be even described well, because if I try to describe them, unless you had a similar experience,
you kind of ruin it. You kind of ruin it a little bit.
You don't know what I'm talking about, because it goes beyond.
I feel like here we understand, we're amongst friends. So.
But here, of course, you know, here is a so I feel much more comfortable than you know.
It resonates, yeah. And but what I'm curious, I'm really curious about, and I talked about this a little bit with Adi Ashanti earlier at this conference. I'm really curious about this, the alchemy of this process. Mm-hmm. So, and you basically kind of explain it in a way similar to the way I talk about it, which is at some point there is a switch from the idea that I have to study the world, that the so-called outside world, and my job is to study that. And maybe, for instance, if I want to understand consciousness, I need to understand certain objective phenomena connected to the brain activity and so on. And that would give me an understanding. But ultimately, it's all outside of what I perceive to be this little me. Mm-hmm. And then there is a switch that actually there is a lot more inside than I thought, than I expected. And I was not aware of those parts of myself. And that comes like, so first step is just accepting that possibility. Mm-hmm. And clearly there is a right moment, there's something happening which is kind of magical. So in other words, it cannot be done by an algorithm. Mm-hmm. That how do you find, because you cannot take someone and, tie them to a chair, like in a Clockwork Orange, like in a Kubrick's movie, and kind of try to make them see their past. And, you cannot. Yeah. They have to do it themselves.
That's right.
And so the question I want to ask, and I don't know if it actually is meaningful, but it is to me at this moment. So how does it happen? And what is it? What is going on at this moment? So do you have any insight? What is the switch? What is going on?
The switch is the desire to know.
Desire to know.
For me, it was the desire to understand, the desire to
right,
know,
but you can
desire to, it was and clearly I was at a point in my life when I was ready. I was ready to cross that boundary, and so obviously there is, what I saw, what I experienced is something that came from a different dimension than the ordinary dimension of consciousness. That is so obvious, right?
Right.
Obvious to me and obvious even when I talk about it. It cannot come from me. It
not from the little me.
Not from the little me, but then all I knew at that time was the little me. So how?
So there is more.
So there's more, right?
To me.
So that's right. So that experience reveals that there is a dimension of being that it was not within the boundaries of scientific understanding.
Right.
Or the worldview of science, everything has to be inside my head, in my brain. And so if I die, that's it, all gone.
Right.
And, poof. Right? So to me, that revelation opened up a door of possibilities that were considered impossible. Right? And it was through that process that then I began to look into my own feeling body, recognizing
what else is there?
Right, that's right. And recognizing that, and it took years to recognize that I did not know what I was feeling most of the time. Of course, if I'm hungry, or if I'm angry, yeah, sure, I know that I'm angry. Or if I have fear, some fears, not all fears, but some fears, I know that I'm fearful. But most other times, I didn't know what I was feeling. It was like a, you know, like a blank,
Blocking, blocking yourself.
blank space. I was not in touch with my own feelings.
Right.
And, you know, and of course, then I discover what protection mechanism I had put in place in order not to feel anything.
Right. And what
except in special circumstances.
What do you think was at the root of those mechanisms?
Well, they are all mostly due to trauma, in, you know, childhood traumas, ways that I had, you know, that I had understood myself in relationship with others and so on. And I had to re-experience many of those, and little by little, my psyche opened up. And, you know, now I would say that probably now I know what I'm feeling, maybe 20%. I'm still 80%, I don't know what I'm feeling. So, I mean, guys, you know, and I've been working almost 25 years on this, so it's not easy to actually know what you're feeling, because sometimes you believe that you're feeling something, then you, lo and behold, you discover that that was not quite right.
And also feelings themselves, just like thoughts, could be kind of could be manufactured in some sense. So in other words, what you talk about is kind of the emanations of the heart, I guess. It's kind of, I would like to separate it from just sort of feelings, which could be also kind of a fake one,
fake
imposters.
Absolutely.
Imposters.
I mean, they're synthetic feelings. I mean, you know, for example, my mom was, you know, my mom would, you know, would say, "Oh, don't you feel this poor guy, you know, don't you feel, you know, for this poor guy?" I didn't feel anything, so I had to pretend to make my mom happy, to pretend that I was feeling compassion to someone that I wasn't feeling compassion
So then you declare that to be a feeling.
You know, so I had to manufacture something in order to make my mom happy, otherwise I was a bad boy or something, right? So I mean, those are the things that we, little by little, we put in place within our own psyche, and they block our capacity to actually know the true feeling, and what's behind the feeling, the meaning of that feeling, because the feelings are carriers of meaning, and the meaning has an unbelievable complexity. It has a rich structure.
Right.
Okay?
It's infinite in essence. It's just that the heart is infinite.
It is infinite, and so the way, how do you unpack this structure? Okay, that's where words are so important. Words are a way that we use
for us.
For
I
us.
suppose for not so extreme left brainiacs.
Yeah, but also
that is never. They don't necessarily have to use that particular channel. But for us, because it becomes such a deeply entrenched habit, right? To encapsulate everything, to transcribe everything.
Yes.
Then we use those words kind of in the opposite direction.
But they are necessary, though. They're necessary for us to understand ourselves. They're mirrors.
The way we see.
They're mirrors for us. Also, for me to communicate with you, I had to use words. I cannot, you know, we don't have telepathy at that level. We have empathy, which is a sense of what you're feeling, but it's not that precise. So in order to understand more deeply what you are feeling or what I'm feeling, you know, we have to communicate. To communicate, we need words. So words are symbols. And
or maybe
through words, we create a world that reflects us.
But do we need it? Do we really need it? Do we really need it? So that is another thing which I...
in my model, we need.
Your model?
We need symbols. In fact, we are symbols. Our body is a symbol. Our body is a symbol.
Right.
Okay.
But is it possible? This is what I've been thinking about. Since, you know, that's my modus operandi as well. What if it's just a fallacy that we say we need words to communicate and so on? What if actually it's the other way around, that actually you and I perfectly understand each other, but the words come up as the cause and effect reversed. So it's not that the words make us understand each other, but the words, the uttering of the words is kind of a side effect of the understanding.
Sure.
You see what I mean?
Yeah, it's a reification. A word reifies something which you perceive without words. Okay? So the true but that's self-perception. I cannot perceive you without words, without you communicating with me.
Well, you could see when I'm sad, for example, right? And if I'm, or if I'm frustrated, that I'm trying to explain something to you, but you don't
only
understand.
Only what appears from the
you
outside.
You will sense that, right?
Yeah, I can sense a little bit, but I can, not the same with the same precision. Not with the same precision and with the same structure and richness that I can perceive what I feel.
Right, but could it be that for myself? I'm wondering, could it be that it's just my doubt, that actually I know, but I ask for confirmation, and I ask for confirmation to come in the form of the words, and it comes, it's oftentimes, but in fact, maybe there is a way to jump over that barrier, kind of, you know what I mean?
But probably when we're dead, yeah. In the esoteric traditions, the consciousness can actually perceive other consciousness without words.
On that note.
Okay, but we're here, so.
Right, so we are here. And, but let's go back to something you said earlier about this inner work that you said you worked with, the diamond method and so on. So on the one side, there is this experience that you described of beauty and bliss, perhaps one could say, right? Of seeing how the boundaries dissipate and dissolve into that sort of unity. Kind of, I could say, positive experience, a nice one, and that gives you a nice feeling. But on the other hand, I would imagine that in the process of that self-discovery that you embarked upon, after that, you had to face some very painful moments as well.
Sure.
And so, I think, so going back to that remark about the alchemy of that transformation, this is where I think the difficulty lies, is there is, in addition to openness, then in addition to the kind of, being able to give a permission to that energies of love and unity and so on to flow through you, it also requires an element of courage, because to face, because the two things go, it's like Ashanti likes to say, it's the two sides of the same hand.
Yeah.
What appears from on one side is this bliss and beauty and kind of nice kindness and so. Yet on the other side, it also appears as conflict, as suffering, as dissociation, right?
Absolutely.
And so, so where does it come from? So this is what I'm kind of curious about, because I was asked to write about this about the first-person perspective for a volume about AI safety, so it's artificial intelligence safety for AI practitioners. And what I try to convey this idea that in this whole debate that we have about artificial intelligence, one aspect of it, which is rarely discussed, if ever, is the first-person perspective. That usually it is a discussion of a kind of theoretical aspects of what is a computer, what is consciousness, and so on. Does it come from the brain? Does it not come from the brain, and so on. And my sense was, and I was occupied with all those questions, precisely until the point when I was able to discover those little boys inside myself, and I was able to break through to them. And when I did, I saw how empty some of those, how devoid of meaning some of those discussions were. In the sense that actually, well, they're interesting, it's fun to talk about this, kind of like a metaphysical discussion, but of no consequence, because they were actually, I saw them as an attempt of my ego protecting me from seeing the truth, the reality of myself, kind of attempts to distract me with these theoretical conversations. So, and yet it appears as though we have a lot of resistance to going there, to finding out. And so what I'm wondering about is, what is it? What is this element? What is it? Or how can we help, for instance, our brothers and sisters in Silicon Valley, for instance, to be able to see, to overcome that resistance? And the way I see it is that the only way we can do it is by sharing our stories. And it's kind of like saying, you know, you are a living example of someone who jumped into that abyss, one could say, right? Because that's what it feels like
it is.
when you discover those difficult moments that were not fully processed, especially in the childhood. And of course, eventually we may discover things that go even beyond, earlier than the birth in the womb, and perhaps even intergenerational. So you then become a living example of someone who went there and came back. So it's like Lazarus, you know, come from the dead. You see what I mean? In fact, I had this. In fact, it's interesting that, like, when I literally had this experience and I came out, I actually, the word Lazarus, you know, that image, that archetype, archetypal sense came to me. And it's not to say, you know, I'm Lazarus, so listen to me, you know, but it is just to say how the process itself has these elements completely beyond, connect you to dimensions of our psyche, of our life, which are far beyond anything any words could ever encapsulate, you see. And so, do you think that there is a way, so since we are now in Silicon Valley, and what we are doing in some sense is that, right? But how do we, is it possible for us, scientists, to actually take this initiative in our community and to find the format, the structure, and arrangement to be able to share such stories, so that those who
well, in some ways, this is a format to do that.
But you know, in some sense, we're preaching to the choir here.
Well, I mean, you know, yes and no.
Yes and no.
Yeah, yes and no. I think that you know, when I don't remember who said this saying, but I read it somewhere. You know, when person ready, teacher comes. You know,
right.
In other words, you know, in some ways, in our lives, there are moments when you're seeking, you're really you really want to.
When you want
so
to,
there is even a prayer which is not even explicit. There is an implicit prayer within yourself.
Right.
To
intention.
To go beyond, you know, whatever is the limitations that you are living, and then, you know, experiences come to illuminate the path, and then, you know, then when they come, of course, you know, you begin to, how to say, to see that you are not alone, and yet I had to go through the sense of aloneness as perhaps the most difficult experience that I had to go through personally. And that was not even a long time ago, it was about 10 years ago. So I felt alone, even despite all the extraordinary experiences of consciousness that came from somewhere, obviously, still I felt that I had to do everything by myself. And that was very hard to go beyond, because fundamentally it was pride. It was pride. I didn't want to ask help. It was, I want to, you know, there was a sense of, I can do it by myself. You know, you know, and so that was actually blocking my capacity to actually ask for help on my high self.
Right.
And, you know,
so
when I went
kind
through,
of a surrender.
it was I was resisting surrender.
Right, because that it gives a sense of, in the story that we tell ourselves, this character Edward or Federico is a strong guy who can push through and do. And in fact, that worked for us for many years.
Sure.
But we get to that threshold of that.
You know, I feel like we are talking about everything but computers and computers, artificial.
But actually,
so maybe you know, let me suggest something.
Okay.
Why don't we? You know, I'm sure that you are here because you are curious to understand what is the difference between a computer and whether we can make a conscious computer or not, what is the difference between a living system and a computer and what have you, right? So why don't we have questions from the audience, and we create a little bit of a larger dialogue here with the audience. Any questions?
Hi, I'm curious if either of you are familiar with David Bohm and his work on trying to develop what he called the Rhea mode of communication, which is a non-symbolic form of communication. He didn't really get anywhere, but I was curious if either of you are familiar with it, because it's very pertinent to what you guys are discussing.
Not in that sense. I mean, I understand the work of David Bohm as, as essentially, he came up with the idea of implicate and explicate order, and so the idea is that there is an order which is invisible, so to speak, and then manifestation from that invisible order. How that connects with communication, I don't know. So I cannot answer that part of the question. But in many ways, I believe that there is that emergence, right? That emergence, there were talks even yesterday about emergence, is a fundamental aspect of nature. So from something that is not visible becomes visible in a structure that was unpredictable and impossible to know.
Hello.
Yes.
I think a lot of us are curious about how is it possible that consciousness can manifest within, say, a robot, this artificial intelligence. From what I understand, I mean, whatever way you want to believe consciousness is here, panpsychism or whatever, that in a robot, you're basically typing, or you're putting in data and software. So how does that equal consciousness? And this is what a lot of people are afraid of. Okay. And it seems to me, you can't manifest consciousness from a machine that's plastic and metal and parts.
Yeah, yes. Let me give an answer, and we can give our viewpoint. So my viewpoint is that a classical computer is a machine, is a reductionist machine made of parts. Parts are discrete, even if you cannot take them apart from the chip in which they are. These parts are transistors. Transistors can turn on and off. But in fact, they don't turn on and off as we think of them. They're not really like a switch, a perfect switch. They have little current even when they are off. And so even the turning on and off is a model that we have about a transistor, but it's still a discrete component, and you put them together, and you create logic gates, and you create a computer, and so on and so forth, and you program it, and so on and so forth. But now, the key thing is that a bit, the bit, which is the unit of information of a computer, is not conscious. A bit is simply a statistical thing that is enforced in the design of the computer. It is a level of voltage that within this level, at that level is a 1. There is a gap, there is a level, in between there is a gap, and then there is between the lower level and the next higher level is a 0, okay? So as long as the circuits inside this chip obeys those rules which are imposed by the designer of the chip, and they only work within certain limited environmental conditions of temperature and so on and so forth, then the computer works, okay? But the bit is not conscious. So any aggregation of bits, no matter how you put it, cannot be conscious, okay? A living system is very different. A living system is made of elementary particles, and if we believe that consciousness is a fundamental property of nature, like I do, well, then the atoms and molecules not per se, but the field that generates the elementary particles, atoms, and molecules are actually conscious. And living systems are aggregations, they are organizations that maintain continuity between the elementary particles all the way to the organism. So you have the consciousness, which is inherent in the quantum fields, is combining into the consciousness of the organism at the highest level. There is continuity between this consciousness. This is not the case in a computer. A computer is simply, you know, and by the way, the elementary particles are not like a bit. They're not a part that you can take apart as if it had no influence by taking it apart other than the function that it's supposed to perform. So the type of information that living systems work on is not the information that we call Shannon information, the information of computers. It is actually a very different type of information. First of all, it is both energy, it is structure. In other words, you know, electrons and protons and neutrons allow you to build structures. So they bring information, but also structural, organizational element, and information that is Shannon information, but it depends on the context in which that particle is. And the context keeps on changing because a living system is an open system. Matter flows in and out of this system. And so we have a very different structure in a living system in cells than in a computer. So a living being then can host a much higher level of consciousness. That consciousness comes from the quantum fields, not from the particles that we think is what exists. The particles are our own interpretation of what the quantum fields create.
We need a mic, either mic or we cannot.
Wait for the mic, please, so that everybody can hear the question.
In the meantime, maybe
in the meantime,
add something.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
So
first of all, I agree with everything, but I have this sense that this doesn't answer the question for two reasons. Well, on the one hand, it is good that we scientists, we go and we actually explain the fallacies of some ideas that are propagated by people who call themselves scientists, but in fact, I would say they're pseudoscientists. For instance, the idea that you could create a copy of a human being or any living being just by reassembling by atom. Or they talk about, well, but can't we know the position, can't we know from equations of physics, the evolution of the universe and so on. This Laplace, 200 years ago, claimed that indeed, if we could have the initial conditions for all the particles in the universe, we would know the story of the universe all the way into the past and to the future. The problem was that and here I'll be a little bit technical, the equations of motion are second order, which means that for initial conditions, it's not enough to know the positions of the particles, but also the momenta or velocities. But quantum mechanics tells us you cannot know both at the same time. Case closed. So why, I would like to say to those scientists, why are you lying to the people? 200 years ago, it was okay to say that. But it's not okay to say now. Even 100 years ago, or maybe 50 years ago, was not okay. So it is important to share that information with people who are not experts, so that they hear from us. And we are today kind of like a priest class, because these days, a lot of people are not religious, kind of educated people, not religious, but we venerate science, we venerate technology. So you and I have a sort of a special role that people will trust us. I feel that people trust me more on these matters of existence, matters of consciousness, etc., more than a poet or an artist or a philosopher. Well, maybe in the case of philosopher, that's the right approach. But I'm joking. Some of my best friends are philosophers. But artists and poets, I would trust artist poets more about, when we talk about these matters, right? Yet, for better or for worse, it's us who are given this authority and agency in discussing this. So I think it's important for us to address specific fallacies, which you did brilliantly. However, I think that to any such arguments, I found there is a counter-argument. Somebody say, well, but it depends what you mean by living, it depends what you mean by replication, blah, blah. And then it continues. It can continue for days, for years, this debate with no end in sight. So what is the solution, in my opinion? The solution is that we shift the conversation from the third-person perspective and to the third person, to the first person perspective, which is why I was very pleased that we could discuss this earlier. I think it's inextricably connected to the question at hand. Until and unless we are willing to actually disclose why, for instance, I think that a computer can be conscious. Why? Why do I want to upload my mind or brain or whatever I call it onto the cloud, which some of the best and most brilliant of us have these ideas, and in the small vicinity of this place, I might add. Why? Disclose why. What is it in you that makes you so eager to give your soul, so to speak, to that computer? And in fact, when we start talking about this, a lot of information comes to light. I spoke about this, for instance, 2 years ago. I talked about Ray Kurzweil, who is one of the proponents of these ideas and talks about singularity and how we will be, the world will be taken over by machines, etc. But then, in some of the interviews, he also gets very personal, I found. And he talks about his father, who died when Ray was young. And in fact, he said, I collected boxes of information about my father, which I want to upload, and to recreate an avatar of my father. Then I upload myself so I can interact with my father. What a beautiful story of a son longing for his father. And we could discuss that on that plane. And perhaps the adult Ray could connect to the child inside who wants who is grieving, is still grieving for the father, but who has not received from the adult the warmth and the love that he needs, you see. So that's when all these ideas about the computers and so on, all the sci-fi stuff, honestly, because a lot of it is really easily falsifiable, all of that will start to fall off, right? And maybe one more thing about anxiety. So when I started this work, introspection, shall we say, 3 years ago, I talked about my personal experiences, and I also talked about my worries about these ideas of artificial intelligence. In fact, I do see around me people, and in your question you mentioned the word that some people are concerned or anxious about this. I think this gets to the heart of the question about artificial intelligence and the possibility of thinking machines or whatever, intelligent machines. This question is secretly a question, who am I? The question, what is artificial intelligence? Is it possible for me to be, is there a difference between robots and humans, etc.? It is secretly a question, who am I? But in this day and age, we feel more comfortable to discuss this question rather than in the scientific plane, on the scientific plane, using the vocabulary of technology and science, rather than maybe 100 years ago, that would be more of a question which would be discussed in a church or in a kind of meeting of philosophical society, you see. But if so, then our job, I think, for those of us who have actually done this work and who actually know what is behind this question, is to help, on the one hand, maybe alleviate some of the concerns by saying science actually, modern science contradicts these ideas, the falsity of these ideas, but also try to steer the conversation. Why are we anxious about it? What does it mean for you personally when you ask this question? And I can speak for myself that in retrospect, I realized that I was anxious. I was worried about robots, and I was angry at people like Kurzweil. Why? I was actually worried about myself. I was worried that I would not be able to connect to those parts of myself that were neglected. You see, it was all inside me. And so then, when I understood, I love Ray Kurzweil. I love that child. I feel like I kind of almost feel him, you know, and I would love to meet Ray, adult Ray, and look him in the eyes. And it doesn't even have to say anything. Just look him in the eyes. I feel that I understand where it comes from. But then it becomes clear that it's okay. It's going to be fine. It will be fine. There will be no robots which will kill us. You know, we'll manage. But we have to talk about this.
Yeah, but on the other hand, science is about third-person experiments and third-person view of the world.
But do you think you could convince, for instance, someone like Ray Kurzweil, and I'm sorry to use him as a kind of a poster boy, but you know, there are many others. Do you think you could actually, if you were here in my chair, I could actually play this game? Well, not now because it's too much time. We could play this game. You try to convince me, but I will give you counter-argument for every argument. It's a never-ending discussion, in my opinion.
I agree.
And
if you are not open,
yes,
if you are not open to reasonable arguments, you will always at least question the assumptions.
But reasonable is a relative notion.
The assumptions are, by definition, are truth that are truth without proof. In other words, even in mathematics, you have a set of assumptions, and then you derive theorems using logic based on the assumptions which are held to be true without proof.
Sure.
So, in other words, if I want to argue with you and don't be convinced from you, I don't agree with that assumption.
Right.
Done.
But the whole point...
There is no longer, and there's no reason to talk about.
So that shows that on this plane, on the plane of logic and reason, we may not be successful in finding common ground.
Absolutely.
But the good news is that what we're discussing here, in my view, is inherently a question of the heart and not a question of the mind.
I agree.
So therefore, if Ray Kurzweil was sitting in the next chair, then we would have a conversation built as a conversation by artificial intelligence. My question to him would be, tell me about your father. I would like to know
and
why.
It was, you know, if I was Ray Kurzweil, I would say, what has my father to do with intelligent robots?
Everything.
In his case, it's his father.
We're going to invite Trump on that chair.
Well, but see, this is an alchemical process, so that it has to be, both of us have to be ready.
That's right.
So that's why Trump is not here.
You're saying exactly what I'm saying.
But one day, he will be. There is no choice. There is no choice but to know who you are. There is just no choice. We do it by destroying, by hurting other people, or we do it by kindness. But one day or another, one day, it will dawn on us what this is all about.
We have a question back here.
Yeah.
Yeah, this kind of goes into what both of you were talking about. When quantum computing comes online and into AI, it seems like, well, like Feynman told, if you're going to build a computer that replicates nature, you have to build a quantum computer. Mm-hmm. And a quantum computer, and that's what I've heard, is that nature is a quantum computer, as is your brain. And so when we're able to start replicating the natural life and the natural forces into a computer that doesn't ever sleep and doesn't turn off and can process huge amounts of information, how does that change the forecast for AI and also moving that into a more human computer?
Yeah, a quantum computer is also a form of reductionistic structure. Because now you take an electron, for example, but you only look at the electron for its spin. And you say, okay, this spin is a qubit, a quantum bit instead of a bit. But the electron is more than just the spin. The electron also has charge. It has, and therefore it creates a field. The electron is also substance. It has mass. It has something else. A living system uses all of that stuff in ways that we do not understand yet. So a quantum computer is simply a form of faster conventional computer using qubits, which are entangled in some form or other, okay? But fundamentally, it uses only one aspect, which is the the entanglement aspect, the superposition aspect of quantum systems, and that's it, but not all the other aspects of information. I'm saying that the information, that the stuff of which life is built is the totality of the quantum fields that combine into eventually the field which is the consciousness of the total organism. I don't expect quantum computers to become conscious either. But certainly quantumness is a necessary condition, but not sufficient to actually have conscious computers.
Hi, first of all, I want to congratulate you for giving something different, which I have been expecting for long. So when I was young, I did vigorous meditations for the higher consciousness, but it never helped me in my everyday life. I had more problems, more things. So when you talked about from third person to first person consciousness, it really, you know, I mean, I'm really happy to listen to that, because we are here to understand whatever it is, whether it's an artificial consciousness or whether it is personal individual consciousness. But my role of now and here is still more important, that how I'm going to use it in my everyday life. Is it going to make my life better with my wife? Or if I do meditations and my wife is shouting at me and I'm taking my mind somewhere away because I'm thinking about God, about Rama or Krishna. Or I'm going to resolve, okay, you know, how I can use that intelligence to remove my stress, to have better communication with my son, so that they're not going to go for drugs. So that has been always my idea. And so I congratulate you, and I also wanted to invite you, the thing you were talking about, that when we are dead, we are going to get that information. There has been investigation by Dr. Werner Meinhold in Germany. So we have those telepathic connections where we can access that information, and it's a scientific proof without guilt, and any trauma can be resolved in 2 or 3 sessions. So thank you very much once again.
Thank you.
Well, I guess, well, maybe one last question.
What do you think of Elon Musk's proposal for a Neuralink, where it's not a separate computer that is becoming AI, but he is proposing to have actual individuals who have consciousness already become connected, and to take away the elitist sort of view of a few people being in control of a few AI machines?
Well, I would like to say that I would seriously consider such proposals only after Silicon Valley shows that it's genuine effort to invite oversight and accountability for what they do. If a company cannot even allows kind of a complete this chaos in the way they use advertisement and so on, and a total unwillingness to be open about it and to curate and to do good for the people rather than just maximize profits, how can we trust a company like this to actually have invasive devices inserted into our brains and stuff like this? How convenient, because of course, you know, in the end, it's all a continuation of this old tradition of direct subliminal advertising and so on, except now it's done directly. And of course, there will be takers. And how do they know about the takers? Because they buy medical information. So they would find people who are likely to be susceptible, to be fooled by this sort of ideas of uploading. And some of those could be based on some very serious psychological events in the past, for instance. So that would be direct exploitation of bypassing our conscious, you know, understanding of something, bypassing, and then, okay, so, and what kind of society are we building in this way? So now, 3 years ago, Edward would be super anxious about this, angry, and so on. And maybe there is some remnant of the anger which comes from there. But today's Edward says, you know what? I'm glad we're having this conversation, and we have more. We have to have more, because this is our opportunity to decide who we are, who we want to be. We want to be the lying in, like in Matrix, lying in bed of Elon Musk's farm, you know, or in those bathtubs like Neo in the Matrix, you know? Or do we want to have light and creativity and community, you know, and beauty and love? And we decide. It's up to us. Thank you.